Good evening, everyone. Well, this isn't off to a good start, is it? My name is Jason Linville, and this is the lecture for JS 110, Introduction to Forensic Science, the lecture on education in forensic science education, whatever you'd like to call it. This lecture is being recorded in the summer of 2017. So if you're accessing this archive lecture in future semesters, anything I say about that's specific to the summer of 2017, like the beginning of the semester, whatever, the blue curtain behind me, you can ignore all of that stuff and just focus on the material in the lecture. For those of you who are taking this course in the summer of 2017, this is the first lecture. This is the first live session that I'm recording, which is often the case the first week of classes. I don't have anybody in the chat room tonight, so I'll be asking myself a lot of theoretical questions and then answering them. Okay, let's see if I can get around this. There we go. All right, you may have noticed, and I don't know how this is going to look in the recording, that there was a pause screen sharing. The reason for that is occasionally I've included polls in this lecture, which is more for the on-campus courses, and I thought it would just be a confusing slide, but apparently when that pops up, I don't know, does the whole thing pause recording? Who knows what happens? This is the first time I'm recording that, so we'll see. Okay. Now, the reason that we're having this lecture the first week of class, no matter what semester you're taking this in, is it's not a chapter in the book. And along with the lecture on evidence and science and evidence, or whatever I call it, these two lectures sort of set the foundation for the course in a way that an introduction chapter in the book doesn't really do. It covers what I want to cover. And this lecture specifically, it's really for students. It's similar to what the lecture that I'd give if I went to a high school, but also for students who are either early in their college education, finishing up their college education, considering a change in their major. You know, the field of forensic science is a little bit confusing in that there's a lot of different career paths that one would consider for a forensic science career, but many times the type of education you need to qualify for those different job opportunities are quite different, and then sometimes they're the same. You know, for example, if you want to be a forensic psychologist, you don't study forensic science. If you want to be a firearms analyst, you don't study firearms, you just study science, chemistry, and biology, and maybe a little bit of forensics thrown in there. So crime scene investigation, well, we have a couple slides on that. So the purpose of this is really it's information for you guys, not just for this course, but also in doing some career planning. And a lot of times this will sort of trigger some questions in you to ask me about, you know, what career you're thinking about doing or what qualifications. And by all means, I encourage you to contact me about that. Okay, so it starts off with, you know, I often get students that come to me and say, Dr. Limo, I want to be a forensic scientist. And when I ask them a little bit more questions about it, I get a wide variety of answers to the questions. You know, when I say, oh, well, what do you want to do? Sometimes they say, well, you know, I'm interested in forensic anthropology. I want to cut open dead bodies. I assume that's in a professional context. I'm interested in fingerprints. You know, I want to be a profiler. So there's all these different areas, and each of them requires a different answer as far as how you get into that career. And what we should be asking about each of these careers is, number one, what does that forensic professional actually do? What is the day-to-day activity? I mean, the actual day-to-day activities for a crime scene investigator may be dramatically different from what you think they are or what you see on TV, because on TV they sort of mash a bunch of different careers into one. And then finally, if you decide that, okay, that's the profession, that's the job title, that's what they do, I'm interested in that job, then the question becomes, okay, what type of education do you need to prepare yourself for that job? You know, in class, if this is on campus, I'd go on and on the first day of class, in addition to reading the syllabus to you, about you know, igniting the reason that we're all here, and, you know, why you go to college and why you get your education and all that stuff. And my pitch to you and to students in general is just a reminder that training will train you how to do a job. education is all about understanding that job and be able to do it well. You know, like if you're cooking French fries at some McRestaurant, well, anybody can train you on how to set the timer and do it. But if you wanted to be the best French fryer in the world, like a professional, then you should study, you know, potatoes, different variety of potatoes and oils, the chemical reaction of what goes into frying, business management as far as how to procure the frying machines. There's just so much knowledge around the profession that you choose that it's actually impossible to know everything about your job. Yeah, anybody can be trained on how to do a job, but you really have to understand it, not just to do the job well, but also to adapt as the world changes around you. And this is really what I try to emphasize to everybody. And the reason why education is so important is because, you know, we sort of think or maybe have been told that, okay, you go in, you get trained on how to do a job, and then you just show up and you do it for 30 years or whatever. But since the world changes around you, you can't just do the job the same for your entire career. So that's why education is important, not just in understanding why you have to change, but if you're the decision maker, you know, if you're the CEO of Blockbuster, then don't just sit on your butt and go, people love DVDs, you know, because guess what? They don't. Or no, they do. We did, but now we like Netflix better. Okay, what am I talking about? This has nothing to do with job duties in forensic science, right? Okay, but in forensic science, if you are becoming law enforcement, if you're becoming a forensic scientist, if you're going into the court system, if you're becoming an attorney, really understanding how forensic science works is going to be very important to your job. So I don't want you to just take this course and try to get good grades, you know, or say, I don't want to be a forensic scientist, I'm going to ignore this lecture. You know, really start now, because you're going to be doing this your entire life until you're dead, about learning about your field and try to be a better professional, because otherwise the world's going to fall apart. I don't know if you've noticed that, but that's a real possibility. Okay, let's go. now that hopefully I've depressed you. All right, I loosely categorize the student interest into these 5 categories when they say, Dr. Linville, I want to be a forensic scientist. Usually they're either interested in being investigators. I'm really good at figuring things out. The laboratory work, you know, squirting chemicals, running the instruments. Crime scene work, okay, finding fingerprints, collecting evidence, etc. Performing autopsies, that's a slightly different one. And then what I call related professions, which would be forensic anthropology, bones, forensic entomology, bugs, forensic psychology, computer forensics would all fall under this category here. Let's start off with investigation. On TV, you know, Grissom or Ted Dan or some other CSI, they're like investigating the crimes. Well, guess what? In real life, a forensic scientist does not investigate crimes. The person in the lab who's doing the analysis really tries to be separate from the investigation. Obviously, they need to know a little bit about the investigation to help them do their analysis. But a lot of times, and hopefully what you'll learn in this course, is when evidence is submitted into the lab, you don't just get a yes or no answer. You know, it's not just like, here comes a fingerprint, and it's like, oh yeah, it's John Smith, and then, you know, they drive, you know, here's his cell phone number and tracking information, then the police go pick him up and he confesses. You know, that's what happens on TV. But in real life, even in a fingerprint comparison, you're comparing evidence. Again, this goes back to last lecture. You're comparing the evidence to a known sample, and there can be gray areas as far as whether an investigator determines whether it's a match or not. All right, so you can imagine if you're a police officer who is in charge of the investigation and you're doing that analysis, and you know that this is really the only piece of evidence you have about this, you know, serial murderer, and you're convinced that you got the right guy because of, you know, other things. I don't know, he winked at you on a security camera or something like that. Then that's going to affect your, you know, all of a sudden if you have this, you know, partial fingerprint that sort of looks like it matches, you may be heavily influenced to go into court and say, yeah, it's definitely that guy's fingerprint and nobody else's, when in reality maybe you can't make that conclusion. Okay, so forensic scientists are usually separate from the investigation. And as far as interviewing suspect, you know, on TV they have like the CSIs come in oh, we can't get anything out of this guy, Grissom. Why don't you try? So the forensic scientist comes into the interrogation room, like throws a fingerprint on the table, and then, he starts crying and confessing. That doesn't happen in real life. The police officers are the one who receive the evidence and, figure out how they're going to use it, and are in charge of the investigation, interviewing suspects, following leads, working with the defense attorney to find out who they're going to prosecute and who they think is the guilty person, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're really, and a lot of people are interested in forensic science, they want to sort of do it all like they saw on TV, but the investigation, that's really police officers. So hopefully this is good news for those of you majoring in criminal justice that are interested in becoming a police officer. And, the investigation is not handled by a bunch of nerds in the lab. It's you, the police officers. All right, and police officers will likely have a degree in criminal justice, so they study the criminal justice system, policing systems, law enforcement, the courts, the corrections, et cetera, et cetera. For those of you, 50% taking this course, who are criminal justice majors, you're learning that, throughout as you complete your degree. For some officers, though, a four-year degree is not necessarily required. So it's not as though you have to have a degree, but having a degree certainly helps, and having an advanced degree certainly helps if you want to work your way up the ladder as far as administration in a law enforcement agency. Okay, so that's investigation. Okay, well, what do the forensic scientists do? Now, when I hear the term forensic scientist, I think of crime lab jobs, because most forensic science programs, if it's titled a degree in forensic science, it really focuses on the laboratory work. So they conduct the lab analysis. They don't wake up at 3 a.m., drive to a crime scene in order to collect. The evidence comes to them in an evidence locker. They go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. They see, or 8. They see what evidence they have to analyze for the day. They're working on a bunch of cases at one time. It's not like on TV where they bring a bag full of evidence and give it to Abby, and then in 2 hours later she's meeting up with them, telling them what she got, and then they follow that lead and go. No, it's where the evidence is submitted to the lab, and then the laboratory processes it as it comes in, and they're working many, many cases at one time, and a forensic scientist is working many cases at one time. If the forensic scientist does have to go in to testify eventually, it's not as though they're testifying the next day. It's like something that they worked on 2 months ago, so they need to make sure they take good notes so they can look it up. So it's not as though the forensic scientist is on the edge of their seat going, man, are they going to catch the murderer from last night? I got to analyze this evidence. No, they're sort of more distance from it. Okay. Now, a lot of students, when they hear that forensic scientists don't get to necessarily participate as much in the investigation as they think, they're disappointed. They're like, well, that's just like any lab job where you're putting stuff in instruments and running the computer and typing up reports. Yeah, it is like analytical scientists in a lot of ways, but everybody who I've spoken to, almost everybody who I've spoken to, a good over 95% of them, who go into the forensic science field, they still, the reason they went into forensic science is because they wanted to get that feeling that they were doing something good for society, and a lot of you who are going into law enforcement or criminal justice feel the same way. And they get that being a forensic scientist, okay? Because even though it's just day-to-day, 9 to 5, you look at what they're doing and it looks like any other analytical scientist, it's still where they're interacting with police officers to discuss the case and discuss their testimony. It's still, they know when they open up, it's not, a paint sample that they're analyzing, or it's not a tube of blood that's been collected that they're screening for different diseases. It's like a blood stain on a piece of evidence that looks like it came from a murder scene, because it did come from a murder scene, and they're still very aware on a day-to-day basis that they're a part of the criminal justice system, they're part of the investigation. Okay, so you don't lose that feeling, even though you're not running to the crime scene and pulling the bloody shirt off the victim. Okay, you receive it in an evidence locker, the next day. All right, so these are forensic scientists because they have to do the analysis, and most of the analysis in the different sections of the crime lab will eventually lead to some type of advanced chemical or microbiological analysis using advanced instrumentation. You need to understand the advanced instrumentation and understand the reactions. You need to be a natural scientist and have a chemistry or a biology degree. In fact, it's written into the staffing guidelines of forensic science labs, you know, the type of jobs that I just described, where they have to have a bachelor's in chemistry or biology. If you have a bachelor's in criminal justice and you've taken a lot of chemistry courses, that's not enough. You need to either be a double major or have a second major of chemistry or biology, because that's the staffing requirement for a forensic scientist job. Okay, so you need to have that natural science degree. For a lot of students who want to get into forensic science, it's where, well, do you want to be a police officer? No, I don't want to get shot. So there's the investigation goes out the window. Do you want to work in a lab? Well, I don't want to take chemistry, you know. And that eliminates almost all of your career options if you don't want to be a cop and if you don't want to work in the lab, or excuse me, if you don't want to take chemistry. Okay, but Dr. Lund, what about crime scene work? Okay, this is sort of an in-between area. And the question here is, who's going to perform the work at the crime scene? Is it going to be a little police officer? Little. Is it going to be the police officer on the left? It's a little it's a small screen I'm in front of. Everything seems little to me in here. Okay, I'm at a little table crowded in my bedroom while children are screaming in the next room here. All right. Is it going to be the little old police officer there on the left, the big old forensic scientist there on the right, or the weird old guy in the middle who's wearing a polo shirt? Really the person, and so we're talking about who's going to go to the crime scene and be in charge of documenting the crime scene and collecting evidence. All right, and it really depends on the law. The reason this is a difficult question to answer is because it depends on the law enforcement agency, whether it's a police officer or a forensic scientist that's come out of the lab, or a civilian in a polo shirt who's been hired to work the crime scene. All right, most often, and as the case is in Birmingham, so if, well, right now I'm in Shelby County, but let's say I drove up the road to Birmingham and then got murdered. Okay, I'm like driving, hey, somebody murdered me for an example for my forensic science, and before I can finish the sentence, somebody stabs me to death. If I was in Birmingham or on UAB campus, the person who would be in charge of that crime would be the Birmingham City Police, and the people that they would send out to process that crime scene would be Birmingham City Police officers. Now, not just officers who were trained to be serve on the crime scene unit, but normally these are experienced officers who have become patrol officers, have put in their time, as I like to describe it, chasing down half-drunk naked people and half-naked drunk people and writing forensic science professors traffic tickets when they coast through a stop sign on South Side, and it was a three-way stop, and I'm pretty sure I came to a complete stop. Nobody was coming from the other direction. Doesn't matter. I'm sure they had to meet a quota or something. But anyhow, that's what you have to do. And then once you establish that you're good police, then you may receive additional training from the police agency and then serve on the crime scene unit as either part of your duties or permanently that's your entire job. Okay. So on the crime scene unit, what happens is if there's a crime scene, then they pack up the truck, they take it out there, and they're basically documenting the crime scene and collecting evidence. Okay. So in Birmingham, if you want to be a crime scene investigator, guess what? You need to become a patrol officer first. So if you're in the camp of I don't want to carry a gun and shoot people, or I don't want to be a police officer, you're out of luck in Birmingham. All right. What about the forensic scientists? Do they ever come out of the lab and help? Sometimes. And again, it depends on law enforcement. In Alabama, all of the forensic scientists work for a central agency called the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. So in other words, if Birmingham City Police collected DNA evidence at the crime scene, they would send it to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences lab, which is a state lab system. The lab would do the analysis and return the data to BCP. But the forensic scientists who work for Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences do not go to crime scenes, or at least they don't go any longer. And because ADFS said, listen, we have these chemists and biologists who are trained to work this instrumentation, we don't want to sort of waste their time, quote unquote, sending them out to do essentially crime scene work that the law enforcement agencies can do. Now, if there's like a high-profile case, ADFS certainly will send out somebody or some of their sections chief to help. You know, if the mayor of Birmingham got murdered, ADFS would probably be there to make sure the DNA evidence is collected properly and, you know, to help out agencies. If it is a smaller, more rural law enforcement agency, you know, some county sheriff that has jurisdiction over the first murder that they've seen in 30 years, then ADFS would, you know, they're not against assisting, it's just they don't do it on a regular basis anymore. Now, if you go up to Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which is the state forensic lab agency up there, they will train their all their forensic scientists to work crime scenes, and they will occasionally send them out, again, usually to more rural areas where they don't necessarily have the law enforcement personnel or equipment or experience to process certain crime scenes, to assist those law enforcement agencies. Okay, so if you want to become a forensic scientist and work in the lab, and you're also interested in crime scene work, just be aware that you may get to do some crime scene work, but you may not do any crime scene work as a part of your job. One of our graduates, Josh, worked for TBI, and he said the first couple crime scenes he did were pretty cool, but then one, like somebody was shot in the back of a car, and he spent like 16 hours in the Tennessee summer heat, like collecting blood evidence out of the back of the car, and he said that was sort of like it. You know, it all became really boring and tedious from that point on. So that's just something to think about. Speaking of which, you know, the important thing to remember about crime scene work, some labs will hire civilians, meaning you don't have to become a licensed police officer. You don't need to become a police officer, you know, and get shot at or have to shoot things. So they'll hire the civilians to process these crime scenes. But even if it's not a licensed police officer, usually it's either where you need some type of experience on the law enforcement side or some type of experience and education on the forensic science side. I know, like, I think the Charleston Police Department up in West Virginia, they have a relationship with West Virginia University, who train some of their forensic science students in specifically in like crime scene investigation. So they will hire students out of school that have that training and, again, aren't police officers. But the forensic science program up there, that it's still science-based and, you know, chemistry courses, so you can't get out of that. One of our students who graduated is working for the Greensboro Police Department, I think in North Carolina, who does the same thing. They don't have the police officers. They hire civilians to do their crime scene work. One of our former graduates worked in a DNA lab and then became head of the crime scene investigation section, the crime scene work section in Arizona, and now he's bounced over to Baltimore, and he's head of the crime scene units in Baltimore, pretty high up there. But again, you know, his background was forensic scientist working in the lab. So unfortunately, if you want to do the crime scene work, the first thing to understand is that crime scene work is not about the investigation, that's the police. It's not about the analysis, because you collect the evidence and then submit it to the lab. It's all about documenting the crime scene and collecting evidence of the crime scene. Now, you get to use some cool stuff as far as dusting for fingerprints at the crime scene, using the alternative light to, you know, try to find semen stains, or maybe spraying luminol to find blood stains. But it's all about documentation. So it's important to remember that it's not the investigation, it's not the lab work, okay? And it's really difficult to get that job unless you have some investigation experience or lab work experience. Okay? So is everybody thoroughly disgusted with the fact that they wanted to be crime scene investigators and now Dr. Linville just crushed their dreams? Well, I apologize for that, but it's better me to crush them than for you to get to the end of your college career and start applying for jobs and have Monster.com crush them for you. Okay, so unlike the people on TV, which I think CSI is finally off the air, except it will forever live on TNT and TBS and Lifetime and Pop TV and every other channel. So I think Ted Danson and Elizabeth Shue were the last one when I pulled these pictures. So for CSI, remember, It's not like on TV where the crime scene investigators do everything, investigating and interviewing suspects and working the crime scene and back at the lab doing the analysis. It's mainly at the crimes. And also, they're not good looking. I like to always tell my students, if I looked like Ted Danson, I wouldn't be here teaching you. I say that, mostly joking. Okay. If I look like Ted, where would I be if I looked like Ted Danson? Who knows? I'd probably be worse off. I'm very happy with what I'm doing here in this tiny bedroom. I'm moving into a bigger house in July, though. All right, let's get right to it. I still drive a Saturn, now with 4 hubcaps. Forensic pathology. All right, Dr. Lim, who cares about crimes? I want to get to the dead bodies. Okay, now this picture, they're not opening up a dead body. I think they're actually looking at human remains and they were found in a sack or something, so this may be more anthropology than pathology. So ignore the picture. But if you're interested in performing autopsies, we'll have a lecture about forensic death investigators, forensic pathologists, medical examiners later in the semester. But at this point, it's important to understand that people who do autopsies are medical doctors. They are medical doctors first, and then through their training and advanced residency and schooling in med school, they study disease. Pathology is a study of disease. They study how people die, and they study how to perform autopsies to determine the cause of death, manner of death, mechanism of death. Okay, so that means if you want to be a forensic pathologist or a medical examiner, you don't just study forensic science and then say, I want to be a medical examiner. You need to go to med school. So that's 4 years of undergraduate, probably with a lot of biology. Get into a good med school, 4 years of med school, an additional 4 years of residency, we're up to 12 now, and then a fellowship at a medical examiner's lab. That's 13 years of schooling, and then you're qualified to become a medical examiner. So it's really, it's about being a medical doctor. Well, what are there, like assistant medical, even if you see a job posting for assistant medical examiner, which the assignment that is due next Monday in the summer of 2017 does involve looking up job titles and job descriptions and job duties and education qualifications. They're usually like entry-level medical examiners. So really to support people in the medical examiner's office, they do have some assistants. Like we have one of our forensic science graduates work at Jefferson County Medical Examiner's office. And, she has a very heavy biology background, anatomy background, and she assists them not really conducting the autopsies, but preparing the autopsies and, preparing samples, maybe looking at some tissues, a lot of the work that will help the pathologist out. But it's not like the medical examiner says, all right, Heather, you take this one, and shoves a dead guy in front of her face. So medical exam autopsies, that's med school that you have to go to. Okay, what if you want to be bones? My least favorite of all forensic science shows is Bones. Okay, mainly because she falls in love with an FBI guy who may or may not be a vampire. I can't really remember, but for a lot of other reasons. But as far as being a forensic anthropologist, the background on Bones is somewhat accurate in that she has a PhD in anthropology and she is a research scientist who does some teaching. I don't know about the whole full-time working for the government doing anthropology, and one time a week they find some weird bones in a place that's close enough to drive to, and it happens to be a fun case where they're running around chasing people. That's not real life. But a real forensic anthropologist or entomologist, they are experts in their field of anthropology or entomology. Anthropology being looking at human remains to try to determine time of death, cause of death, identification usually for forensic anthropologists. And to do that, you need to know a lot about the field, and you actually need to be a research scientist in the field. So usually these individuals have PhDs and they work at universities. Okay? And doing casework is not their full-time job. Usually their full-time job is teaching classes, conducting research, writing papers, and then occasionally they will get called upon from a law enforcement agency to analyze evidence. Okay, because oftentimes when human remains, the medical examiner can identify them. It's like the guy's wallet was, sitting next to the bones. Okay, there, case closed. You don't need to send it to a forensic anthropologist. Okay, forensic entomologists who help estimate time of death, sometimes that's not necessarily important to the case. So they're really more research scientists who work at universities as opposed to working at law enforcement agencies. If you go down to Birmingham City Police, kick in the door and say, take me to your forensic entomologist, they're going to, one, arrest you. You just ruined their door, okay? AC's not putting up with that. But they're going to say, I'm sorry, as they put the cuffs on, but we don't have a forensic entomologist. There's not enough case. They're not going to take you to some old guy in the back with big goggles on looking at a fly. Forensic psychologist. You're going to notice a theme here. If you want to be a forensic psychologist, you need to be an academic in the field of psychology, meaning that you normally get your undergraduate in psychology, go to graduate school where you become a research scientist and get a PhD in psychology. And I should have said that before for anthropology and entomology. That means you go to graduate school after you complete your 4-year undergraduate degree and usually get a research degree, a PhD degree, which would take an additional 4 years. Okay, so for forensic psychology, as we're going to find with this lecture later in the semester, there's a lot of different sub-areas of it. It's not just profiling. So if you want to become like the people in Criminal Minds, there's only a handful of those people, and in order to get that job, you're probably going to have to spend a long time writing research papers, writing books, I don't know, writing books on serial or whatever, but it's not as though there's a lot of work as a full-time job for that. You probably end up at a university, teaching classes, conducting research, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So now hopefully you can sort of see here that the theme that we're getting to, and forensic odontology, forensic dentistry, just real quick before I sum this up, same thing. You usually become a dentist, and forensic odontologists, they usually help out with mass disasters, identifying human remains using dental records. But that's not a full-time job. So normally they're a full-time dentist. They go to a couple workshops that teach them how to work on a team when it comes to identifying human remains, and then occasionally they'll do that type of casework, on the side in addition to their regular practice. Okay, although I'm sure that's not going to stop Fox from next season, this fall, 2017, Teeth, a reserved forensic odontologist teams up with a brooding FBI agent to fight crimes involving teeth every week. Oh, geez. And one of them is a witch. There, how's that? How's that for a nice twist? My wife watches a lot of these shows. And one of them is friends in high school with Jughead. I don't know. Good Lord, there's a lot of TV. When I was young, don't worry, I'll limit myself to maybe just like 15 throughout the semester of when I was young stories. People watched movies, because TV was garbage. Now it's the other way around. All right, so forensic odontology, you become a dentist. You get your dental degree, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years, and you're a dentist who occasionally dabbles in forensic odontology. The theme for all of these is, in order to be a professional in a forensic field, okay, for all these related things, you end up getting your degree and your education in that field. So in other words, if today you're like, I don't know if I want to be a forensic psychologist or a forensic anthropologist, tough. You got to decide, because you either need to study anthropology or psychology. I mean, I guess you could get like a double major or something, but that's a lot of work. But if you're like, well, I want to be either a drug analyst or a fingerprint analyst, well, guess what? For both of those, you study chemistry, okay, or biology. So you don't have to decide right now if you want to go into drugs or chemistry, drugs or fingerprints, because the education is the same for that. But if you're trying to decide between anthropology or psychology, or psychology and becoming a police officer, then at that point you have some decisions to make. Okay. Okay, now I said a forensic scientist is mainly focused on the laboratory work, and that's what this course is mainly going to be about. We're going to go through the different areas of what forensic scientists do, although late in the semester we are going to get into forensic pathology and entomology and psychology, but we're going to go section by section of the different types of evidence that a forensic scientist may analyze in the lab. In other words, fingerprints may come in, and a fingerprint analyst is going to analyze that. The point I'd like to make here is, again, not to keep going back to it's not like on TV, but it's not like Abby who does everything on the NCI. You know, hey, we have we have evidence, you know, give it to our forensic scientist. Like, why hire somebody else, for crying out loud? I don't know, maybe she's part of a team that they just don't show, but whatever. It's where there's different sections. So normally when you get hired by a lab, they will train you in one of these sections. So again, if you want to be a fingerprint analyst, you don't necessarily have to have your education in fingerprints. It's usually where you have education as a forensic scientist, you'll be hired and they'll train you on how to be the fingerprint analyst. Fingerprints is a little bit weird because some people do it the old way where they just, you know, hire people who aren't scientists to do it, but you can ask me if you want more details on that. You know, firearms, you'll get hired by the firearms section. We've had several of our Masters of Science and Forensic Science students graduate and get hired by firearms sections, and they're trained by a firearms analyst. Okay. Question documents, same thing, trace evidence. So normally when you get hired by a lab, your education has sort of prepared you maybe a little bit more in one of these areas than another, but it's not impossible to get hired as a trace evidence analyst and not really have any education or experience analyzing trace evidence. As long as you're a really good chemist and you have a good background and maybe a couple forensic science courses, you're going to be qualified to be hired for that job, and they are going to train you how to do the job, how to analyze that specific type of evidence. But what they can't train you how to do is how to understand chemical separations or you know, understand how capillary electrophoresis works. That's what they're going to look at your transcript and make sure that you have good grades in your science classes. Then they know, okay, I can take this person who's a good student, okay, and understands the background chemistry and biology, and I can train them how to analyze trace evidence. You know, put a fiber in an ATR and read the IR spectra and tell me whether it's polyester or not. Okay. All right. So you don't necessarily need to focus on any of these jobs, but you'll, if you get your background education in chemistry or biology, then you can apply for any of those jobs and have the potential for getting hired. Again, the assignment that you're going to do this week really focuses on looking at different jobs and seeing what type of education is required. Okay, so if I get hired as a forensic, regardless of the section, what are you going to do? What about advancement? Where are you going to work? These are some questions that we want to answer. Okay, number one, the sections, like I said, lab is usually divided into different sections, and you will get hired to work in one section. That's what you'll be trained in. And if you're a drug analyst, every day you're going to go in and you're going to analyze drugs. It's not like some days you'll do drugs and some day you'll do DNA. But within each of these sections, there's a lot of variety. So it's not as though you get bored with doing the same thing over and over. I mean, with drugs, you could run the ATR, you could do blood alcohol, you could run the GCM, you know, you could do extractions one week and then the instrument analysis the next. But every day, the daily work, as it says there, is going to be very similar, where inside the lab, most of what you're going to do is bench work. This is sort of hard to describe. You know, you picture a scientist in a coat like swirling a test tube, you know, and looking at it. Or going through one of those fancy distillers that they have in Tom and Jerry cartoons, you know, and like catching drips at the end. Well, in reality, no matter what type of evidence you come in, you usually get it dissolved into some type of liquid form. Okay, and then you use a pipette to transfer it to other tubes and to add other reagents to it and shake it up or put it on a shaker or put it in a centrifuge to separate the sections. And you're basically purifying the substance that you're trying to analyze. So a bunch of white powder comes in, you're trying to purify, get the cocaine out of there, and then confirm it's cocaine. Okay, blood comes in, you're trying to purify the DNA in that blood and then amplify it and separate it on an instrument. So a lot of it is just using pipettes, you know, putting things in centrifuges and mixers, doing extractions, and then eventually everything winds up into a small tube that goes into an advanced instrument, and then you set it a computer and use the computer to run the instrument, and then you sit at a computer and use the computer to analyze the data and to make your conclusions. Okay, so it's, bench work at the bench, at a computer. Occasionally you'll get called outside the laboratory. Every once in a while, maybe maybe once it can be anywhere from, I would say, 5 times a year to 20 times a year that a person will get called into court to testify. I think those numbers are probably about right. It's not like you're getting called into, because most of the time you do the analysis, the police officers get it and they do a plea bargain. Okay, so there's no trial. But every once in a while, a case that you've worked on will go to trial and you'll have to go into court and testify. Now, if you're saying, Dr. Linville, I want to be a forensic scientist. I love lab work. I hate public speaking. I want to be the forensic scientist that does the analysis, but not the one that goes into court. Tough. You have to, if you do the analysis, you're the one that has to go into court and tell the jury and the attorney and the judge what you did and what it means. Okay? Now, you're not going to get thrown into court, on day 2 of employment. You go through an extensive we're talking 6 months to 2 years training process of where you're working samples. You go through mock evidence analysis, you go through mock testimony, and the forensic scientists that you work with will train you to make sure you don't do anything dumb when you get into court and have to testify. Okay, so it's not that bad. Crime scene work. We already went over this. Not necessarily required, but you might end up doing it. And then, like any other profession, you'll have meetings and workshops and continuing education that you'll do. All right, advancement. The great thing about being a forensic scientist and working for a government lab, a state or federal lab, is that it's sort of like, if you're familiar with the GA or the GS systems in federal government, like the ranking, like you put in your time, eventually you're going to get promoted to a higher level, get paid a little bit more. So experience counts, especially in forensic science. Okay, after you testify in court, which I just got done telling you, you need to go through 6 months to 2 years training before you can testify in court. You become extremely valuable. All right, I like to think that I'm a pretty smart guy. Been doing this forensic science thing for over 10 years. But if somebody's going to hire a person who has 3 years of work experience, has already gone through training, and me, an incredibly handsome and intelligent forensic science professor, they're going to hire the other they're going to hire the other person. Okay, because they can just hire them and they've been trained, they can go into court and they can testify, but they have to put me, even though I have a lot of education and experience teaching forensic science, I would still have to go through that training process before I'm allowed to testify in court. Okay, so once you go through that training process, all of a sudden other agencies want to hire you, and the agency that hire you doesn't want to let you go. There's good job security there. Okay, you put in your time, eventually you're going to get promoted to forensic scientist level 2, level 3. For some of the higher level positions, they want you to have a master's degree. A master's degree is required to have like a supervisory position. If you want to become like an assistant director or section chief or lab director, then again, a master's degree is usually required. You don't have to have a PhD, unless you're in toxicology. Sometimes in toxicology, PhDs help, but you don't have to have a PhD, just a master's degree, a little, 2 years additional education, and you can work your way up the ladder. And guess what? It's not like somebody's going to jump over from Google, and take the lab director. No, you have to work your way up the ladder in crime labs. Most of them, maybe for a really high level or something like that. But no, for all those supervisory positions, you need to go in the entry and work your way up. So it's really good as far as you're going to be promoted, you're going to be paid more, which when we get to pay, we'll talk about that. And it's good security. And right now, there's no fear that all the forensic scientists are going to be fired or no longer needed or anything like that. Okay, even if they legalize drugs, there's still people do dumb stuff where there's still going to need forensic scientists. Even if they just, Attorney General Sessions, I think there's a good chance he may just wake up tomorrow and say, hey, all drugs are legal. Smoke them if you got them. Okay, where are you going to work? I've been throwing around these at like Alabama Department of Forensic Science, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Every state has a system of labs that will analyze evidence from every agency, okay? So in other words, it's not as though, oh, our sheriff's department, can't afford DNA analysis. I guess the murderer will go free. No, the state that agency is in usually has a lab where they can submit it. Okay, now, so like Alabama, it's Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. Now, city labs or local labs like Birmingham City Police, they don't want to submit all of their evidence to ADFS, so they have their own firearms section, they have their own fingerprint section at Birmingham City Police. But if they have DNA or drugs, then that goes to ADFS. And right now there's a big debate in Alabama about drug analysis, whether, local law enforcement agencies are going to start doing some analysis or whether they want to keep sending it to state. But anyhow, okay, there's always a place to go and get it. Now, every state is a little bit different. In Alabama, it's Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, an independent agency. It's not, under any law enforcement. Tennessee, it's under the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation is where the lab system is. Alabama still has the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, but that's not where the big lab is located. In Georgia, the big state lab is under GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. In South Carolina, it's SLED. What is that? South Carolina Law Enforcement Division or something. In Florida, there's Florida State of Law Enforcement that the state lab system is under. But if you're in Dade County, Miami, Dade County has its own lab that does everything because there's so much crime in Dade County. Okay, so there's a system in each state, but the problem is you can't just go and look up, let's see if there's any jobs in Missouri Department of Forensic Sciences. Okay, Missouri, and I don't know how Missouri does it, may have Missouri Bureau of Investigation. They may have Missouri State of whatever. They may just have the city labs that do all the work. So it's where the name of all these labs can get confusing. And so you just have to do a little bit of work when you're applying for jobs to figure out what agencies are in each state, especially if, like, you came to UAB from California and you want to go back in California to work in their lab systems, which they have pretty big state system. You need to live in California and take a test. There's something weird about California. Okay, there's also federal agencies that hire forensic scientists. So FBI, everything, DEA, drugs, ATF, firearms, armed forces has DNA labs to help with identification of human remains. They also have mobile labs. They also have labs for military crimes. I'm trying to think of the words here. Secret Service and U.S. Postal Service, as well as Customs, all have hire document analysts, question document analysts. So there's a lot of federal agencies that will also employ forensic scientists. Now, the great thing, if you do decide you want to become a forensic scientist and start studying biology and chemistry and its application to the forensic science field, guess what? You're studying how to become an analytical chemist or a molecular biologist, or sort of a combination of the two. That means you can do a lot of other things, including work at private forensic science labs that do the same exact thing as the state labs. There's private, you think when Maury Povich does his paternity testing that he, sends it to the FBI, dear FBI, here's next week of sweeps, love Maury. No, he'll send it to a paternity lab. There's also private DNA labs, which since this is a recorded lecture, I'll make it short, but a lot of times when you hear about DNA backlog in states, it's a backlog of rape kits that don't have a suspect associated with them. So they sort of fall down the level of importance on the analysis ladder. They start to stack up, and then they do one and they get a hit on a rapist who's been out for 3 years because the lab kit's been sitting there for so long. And then everybody in the state goes crazy and they throw together a bunch of money to get all those old kits analyzed. But it's not like the state lab is going to hire, 50 new analysts to get rid of the backlog. What they do is they pack them up, they send them to a private DNA lab that will take the contract, and then the private lab just goes through all of them and returns the data to the states. It prevents the states from having to hire a bunch of new employees when they get a backlog that may be temporary. Because if you hire a bunch of people, then at the end, after the backlog's gone, you have, too many employees. So there's private DNA labs. Drug analysis, if any of you had to pee in a cup to play high school athletics, those samples aren't going to the FBI or Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. if you have to urinate in a cup, I'm sorry, I keep saying pee in a cup, but for work, for employment screening, for life insurance, I had to urinate in a cup, I guess, so they could make sure I wasn't dying. And I guess I passed, although my rate went up, so I don't know what that, anyhow, that's private lab. Non-forensic labs. Again, you're trained as a chemist. Okay, we had one of our students working for Valspar doing quality control, chemically testing the lining of the paint cans to make sure that it was the right polymer composition. You can get a job over in the UAB hospital. We have a lot of our students who want quick work. They work for Bioplasma Services down in Hoover. It's a lab that screens donated blood samples, because the type of analysis you do to amplify and analyze viruses in a blood sample is the same thing you do when you amplify and analyze human DNA in blood stain from a crime scene. Okay, so you're trained on how to be an analytical scientist, an analytical chemist, an analytical biologist. You can do a lot of things. So the great thing is, if you want to live in Birmingham and work for Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, but they're not hiring this year, you can do other work with your degree until you get that sort of dream job, forensic science job. Okay, so that's why I like it, because it's not like you have to go work at Arby's, which I'm sure Arby's is a fine organization. It's just that I have a personal beef, no pun intended, with the one on 7th Avenue South. Okay, let's get into money. $35,000? Dr. Linville, are you serious? You want me to get a 4-year degree, maybe go to graduate school? 35, well, it's probably a little bit more than that. This is sort of an older slide, but that's entry level. Remember, at the entry level in a forensic science lab, you're going to go through 6 months of 2-year training, and you're going to get promoted. You're going to make more. So let's look at that advanced level, where 5 to 10 years after you're working, there's a very, very, very good chance that you're being promoted to those salaries. So it's a good long-term career. Okay, entry level, they don't want to hire somebody, pay them a lot of money, have them get trained, and then go somewhere else. So it's sort of where, I don't know, maybe the entry level will start to go up a little bit. But that's just sort of that's sort of the system. I mean, since everybody who comes in is almost guaranteed to being promoted, making more in the future, then I guess they can offer a little bit lower at the entry level. All right, trained analyst is valuable. Most government jobs, you work for a state agency, they have good benefits, so you qualify. You don't have to fight for health insurance, which apparently is a hot topic here in these United States of America. What's my major? This is a wrap-up. Remember, in high school, even, some colleges, students early on, when they're trying to figure out how to become a forensic scientist, somebody will say, well, study chemistry and study criminal justice. Get a double major. And that's fine, okay? But I just want you guys to realize that if you want to work in a lab, it's really mostly science, okay? If right now you're majoring in criminal justice because you want to work in a lab as a forensic scientist, you got to switch your major to chemistry or biology. Still take the forensic science courses. I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt. But even if you don't want to take any forensic science courses, it's still where you need that chemistry or biology degree, okay? So if you never want to see me again and become a forensic scientist, well, guess what? You can do that if you want, okay? All right, chemistry or biology, and again, these are for the laboratory jobs that we talked about earlier, the forensic science lab jobs. And again, when you go online and are looking at jobs in that first assignment, I want you to think about these things, sort of categorize the job title and then see if the education matches up with your expectations. All right, there are undergraduate forensic science programs which can give you advantage in getting a forensic science job, especially if they have like an internship associated with them. But really, if they have to pick like a BC student who graduated from Ole Miss with a degree in forensic science, okay, they have an accredited program over there, versus AB student who graduated with a chemistry degree from UAB, they're going to hire the AB student. They're going to hire the better student, okay? So forensic science undergraduate degree can help you out, but chemistry and biology is just as good. Like I mentioned, some of the advanced jobs, the higher level supervisory positions will require a master's degree. It's not a master's in forensic science. It can be a master's in chemistry, a master's in biology, just some type of natural science master's degree. But we do have I mean, the reason why we have these forensic science courses and all these great instructors is because we have a Master of Science in Forensic Science program here at UAB. So definitely if you guys are getting up there junior, senior, in your chemistry or biology majors and thinking about going into a forensic science program, you know, come to talk to me, talk to Dr. Gardner. The advantage to getting that degree is you're not going to hit a ceiling once you get a job as a forensic scientist where you can't get promoted. You have to go back to school to get promoted to those supervisory positions. So a lot of students just like to get it out of the way. Also, those entry-level jobs, you know, even though they don't pay $1 million, they are tough to get. I mean, when forensic science labs open up a job, they get a lot of applications to fill those positions of qualified individuals. And although it's an unfair example to use, because Birmingham has UAB in the Forensic Science Master's Program, you know, when ADFS a couple years ago hired 8 people, they all had master's degrees. And then a couple years later, I think they hired 6, and 5 of them had master's degrees. So a majority here in Alabama have master's degree. Now you go out west where there's maybe not as many masters in forensic science programs, and they may be more likely to hire somebody with a bachelor's degree, but having a master's degree definitely gives you an advantage to getting a job. And more importantly, like I said before, it gives you that additional education and understanding of the field, and you actually get courses where you're, like in our forensic DNA course, we give you blood stains and semen stains, and you take them through the whole screening, amplification, DNA analysis process with the instruments that you're going to use in a forensic science lab, and that makes you a lot more competitive when it comes to a job interview because you know what you're talking about. Okay. It's worth noting that not all jobs will have crime scene work associated with them, so don't expect to be like on CSI where you're doing everything. Death scene investigator, you may find this position when you're completing your assignment. That's usually a position with the medical examiner's office, and even though it looks like it would be a totally cool job to get right out of right out of college, usually they're looking for somebody, an experienced law enforcement officer, so like maybe a retired investigator will go work for the medical examiner, and the death scene investigator essentially serves as a communicator between the medical examiner's office and the law enforcement agency. So the medical examiner isn't going to go to every crime scene, but they'll send their death investigator to essentially, you know, take care of the paperwork, make sure the body is collected properly, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So CSI, crime scene investigators, do exist. That may be a true-false question, but it's not like on TV where they're handsome and do too much. All right, here's the website you're going to go to. So you're going to click on, you can't see my arrow here, and I don't have my ink turned on, but you're going to click, if you look at the top there, there's a little thing called resources. That's right, that's why I added this slide, because sometimes it can be tough to find. But the description's in the assignment. You click on resources, you go to job opportunities, and the great thing about this website, for those of you interested in forensic science career, is that almost all forensic science agencies will post their positions on this website. You know, except the FBI, they do it on their own site. So if you're a lab looking to hire somebody, you post your job here. If you're a forensic scientist looking for a job, you go here. It's sort of unique in a career where there's one good website that has a lot of these job listings. And here I just sort of give an example of what you'll be seeing. Okay, this is for Nassau County. I think that's up in New York, where they're hiring forensic scientist 1. That's an entry-level forensic science position. If I didn't emphasize that before, it starts usually at the 1 level and goes 2, 3, and 4. So it has the duties here, you know, which is basically doing lab work and maybe meeting with officers. Here's the qualifications for that job. You can see there, graduation from a regionally accredited college or university with a bachelor's degree in a natural science. Okay, and then they have a couple other. You know, if it says criminalistics, don't think that that's the same as criminal justice. Criminalistics is one of these weird degrees that sometimes it's more like a forensic science program. All right, Jobs, there's another couple other websites, and then is this the last slide? Almost, boy. This is long for the first week, isn't it? This is a reminder, if you want to work in a forensic science lab, it's the same as working in a law enforcement agency. For anybody who's a criminal justice student or a chemist or biologist looking to get into forensic science, it's they're going to do a background check. So you got to start today, live your life cleaner than you would if you were becoming a banker. No, not that all bankers do cocaine or any other drugs, but so I've heard. Hey, my uncle was a banker, and he was mayor of a small town, and to my knowledge, never did any illegal drugs. Although who knows? Anyhow, it's a background check. So in other words, past landlords. Everybody has crappy landlords and crappy employers, right? Don't if you move out from a bad landlord, like spray paint profanity or take a dump on the carpet before you move out, because they're going to interview. You're going to apply for a job. They're going to interview that guy. He's going to say, "Oh yeah, Jason Linville, he took a dump on the carpet when he moved out." A real terrible person, and then you don't get the job. Same thing for employers. When you're quitting your Arby's job, don't give everybody the double middle finger as you're urinating into the deep fryer. Number one, you could get burned. And number two, it's that they're going to interview your employer, and that's going to come up. Okay? So leave with grace, don't. A DUI is bad. Sometimes one DUI is enough to disqualify you for a lot of jobs. So be careful about that. Even if it's some type of public urination. Is the cat locked in here? Okay, the cat's destroying the carpet. That means it's time to wrap it up. You may have to take a polygraph, but polygraphs are garbage. More on that later in the semester. Strict on past drug use. So again, it's still unclear. You may not, if you go to California, if you go to Colorado and smoke marijuana 15 times legally, that may disqualify you for some job. So it's still not clear on what the rules on drug use are if you're legally using in a state that's legal, because federally, marijuana use is still not legal. So again, now definitely if you're just going to be smoking weed in Blunt Hall, don't do it. Okay? I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to have any fun. Not that it's fun or anything like that, but it's just you can't do drugs. Drugs are not legal, and if you want to be part of the law enforcement community, then you can't do drugs. You can get a speeding ticket, but don't get 50 of them and never pay them. That's not good. So it's where you just have to keep a clean record. Okay, keep that in mind now as you're going out and planning all of your shenanigans that you do when you're a young person. All right, job availability. Jobs are open. The fields, with forensic science jobs, there's always a lab hiring, but since it's such a small field, if ADFS isn't hiring this year, then you can't get a job as a forensic scientist in Alabama. Sorry, but some states hiring somewhere. So it's a matter of either working in a related field until the job opens up in the location that you want, or moving around until eventually you get to relocate where you want to be. All right. Okay, so hopefully this first lecture made sense to everybody. We're off to a good start. If you haven't already watched the old one, I'm going to try to get this new one up for the summer of 2017. And I'll send out a better reminder. Again, this is the first week of class, so a lot of times I don't get a lot of people in the chat room to remind you when the future live lectures are going to be, how to get it. Hopefully I'll make sure that maybe the link was bad or something. That's why nobody's here tonight. But we'll work that out. So if you have any questions early in the semester, let me know. And have a good one. Where's the stop button?